Hey folks, DJ here. Today we're going to be talking about how to export your animations correctly out of Blender. And we're going to be going over a lot of the kind of like basics here, but also some more advanced stuff like what file types you should be exporting, why you should be doing image sequences over video files, all kinds of stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get started quickly here. So here what I have is a animation that I did for a recent tutorial series on how to do fireballs in Blender. So if you want to check that out, you can look at the series. I'll put a card in right here, but I'll also put a link to the series below in the video description. But you can see here that I have this animation with particle effects and everything else going on. And this is just what it looks like in the viewport. But if I turned on the noise, it would be a lot more detailed, like what you're going to see in the test render. But before we get there, I just want to talk about some, fairly basic stuff here. So the first thing I'm going to recommend that you do, especially since a lot of people don't have the kind of computer I have, and just so you know what kind of computer I have, what I have is a computer that has a Threadripper 3960X and a RTX 3090. So for a lot of people, this is kind of like not in your grasp of getting, okay? Because this is a very expensive rig. This is a very, high-end professional rig, and a lot of you guys don't really need this type of thing. So I'm going to give you some pointers on how to like export your animations so that you can test them out, make sure that it's going to work, and especially when you're sending it out to your clients and everything, you don't waste your time rendering something for like 3 or 4 days and it's not really ready. And I'm also going to show you how to export for a final with the ability to do some post compositing and stuff like that. All right. So the first thing is what a lot of times will recommend to people is that you'll want to do a viewport render before you send out a final. You want to make sure that whatever the animation is, whether it's a character animation or a fireball simulation or something like this, you can do a very simple export of your viewport here, and it will send that out to an image sequence, or you could even set it up as a video file, but I prefer not to do that. But you can basically render out what's in your viewport. Let me just make this boom like that. You can basically just render out what's in here, okay? And it's in my opinion, if you are a beginner especially, or if you're working with clients and you have a lower end computer, you really need to do this step to make sure that everything's going to work out properly, because sometimes you'll find, even if you've checked every frame and all that kind of stuff, you'll find that there's like a frame or two that might have some mistakes. So if you set this to your material preview for Eevee, the Eevee engine, and if you want to do a rendered version as well, you can do that. But basically, it will render out whatever's in your viewport settings here. So if we go over here to our render settings, what we'll need to do before we actually start this is we need to go, not to render settings, actually. We're going to go over to the output properties here. And you can see here that I have my resolution set to 1920 by 1080, but I have a 200% here. So basically it's at a, 4K in quotes, 4K resolution. The other thing here is you need to make sure that you keep your frame range correct. So, whatever your animation is, for this one, it's just 60 frames. But if you just wanted to do a part of it, you could just reduce this down or something like that. You can also change the steps. So if you just wanted to see like every other frame or something to reduce the amount of time that it takes, you can take the steps down and make it a lot easier for you. As far as looking at the overall render, let's say you just needed to see some particular keyframes, or you just wanted to check out poses or something like that, you can change that in the steps here. And of course, there's this time stretching, which I'm not going to go too much into right now. Basically, you can speed up your footage or slow it down with this here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about output properties, okay? So a lot of people are taught to export out AVI JPEGs or any of these AVIs or this, MPEG video here. I do not recommend doing this. The reason why is that, frankly, you don't know what's going to happen with your render. At any moment, your computer could shut down. You need to turn it off for some reason. Power outage happens, something like that. And you lose your entire animation because it doesn't finish compiling all of your images into a sequence, and then you lose out on that. So, my recommendation is always, always, always to save out image sequences. And there's a whole bunch here. And I guess I'll talk about some of these like rather briefly, but I'm only going to go into the things that really, really matter. as far as the uh, animation for CGI and VFX and all that kind of stuff. So most of the time when you're rendering out a viewport render, you really don't need a whole lot of data, okay? A JPEG will work just fine. And it's a very, very small format. And it's what's called a lossy format. And I'm not going to go too far into that. I might make a separate video on lossy versus lossless. But JPEGs are really, really compressed. They're very, very small image files. And with that, it's great because it's easy to transfer, but it also will remove a lot of color information. And that's why it's called lossy, but it is very compressed. Now, the next sort of like step up from there, I would argue, is the PNG. And PNG, a lot of people use this. It's less of a lossy format. You do get a lot wider range, but it is limited. And you get the alpha channel with a PNG. So a sequence like this, if I open up the render setting here, you could see that I have a smoke and fire simulation, and then I have this back here, and basically there is, if we look up here, there is an alpha channel, okay? So alpha channel is the white and the black, which basically says what's transparent, okay? So if I wanted to save this out as an image sequence and keep it nice and light, I might choose a PNG sequence, which allows for that to happen. And a PNG will allow me some color information to do some other compositing and stuff like that. And I'll get into some of the generalized stuff with compositing within Blender in a minute, but just, keep in mind that if you are using a PNG format, it's because you need that alpha channel or you want to keep that extra color information. Now, let's just go back to this here. The other format I want to talk about TIFFs. If you're, this is basically a layered file, kind of like Photoshop has a bunch of layers and stuff like that. Usually don't use it for VFX and stuff. As far as I'm concerned, I don't use that. And Cineon and DPX, these are used in film. From my experience, Cineon and DPX, these are usually, and I'm using this rough because it's my experience from when I was doing this professionally. Cineon and DPX is usually for the plates that are derived for the VFX to be composited onto. Usually, what you end up getting are these open EXRs. And in my opinion, the open EXR is the best format for your layers. So if you need to have a Z-depth channel, you have some matting, you have like I said, alpha channel and your image channel, or you have any other sort of things that you're trying to bake out into an image sequence for compositing, the OpenEXR or OpenEXR multilayer, these are really the areas that you want to use, okay? For us to basically export out an animation for us to composite later in another program, which I'm going to be showing everybody how to use DaVinci Resolve to do this in the next video I'm going to make for this channel. This is really where you want to be, okay? With that being said, when you render out a single image, okay, I can go in here and I can just go image, save as, and I can choose the different file format and everything else for compression, all right? Now, when we're doing an animation, we have to set this stuff up first because it's going to basically copy all that information for the entirety of the animation render. So if I click the little folder icon, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to this particular file, which is kind of, there's kind of a lot of stuff in here, but I'm going to make a new folder, okay? I'm going to hit the little plus here for the folder, call this render, and go inside here, and I'm going to hit the little plus again for this file here, and I'm going to call this EXR, okay? And inside there, I'm going to then save the files inside of here, and we're going to name this something. Now, if you were saving out a viewport render, you might want to save that out into a different folder. Whatever it is basically that you're exporting out, you want to save that folder as. So a lot of times I'll end up having an EXR folder, I'll have a viewport folder, I might have a PNG sequence or something like that that I'm compositing on top. I don't know. Sometimes this can get a little bit hairy, but you need to make sure that you are saving out the right folders for whatever the file format is. All right. And sometimes you might need to create folders within folders just to make sure that everything is nice and aligned, because in the end, you're going to have a comp version, which is going to have your final composite. Okay. So if we go into the EXR here and we try to give this a name, we can't just pick any old name out of a hat. You kind of have to think about this in terms of your overall like file saving management system. And every company will have a different way. But how I like to do mine is either all caps and underscores or all lowercase and underscores. Okay. So I'll just call this fireball underscore sim underscore let's call this V1 for version 1. And then the next part here is really important because what we need to do is we need to establish frame padding. So frame padding basically is the on the end of a file name, it's going to tell you what the actual frame number is, but we also need to give it a sort of like a designation to know what the number of digits should be. So a lot of times with VFX, it's either 4 or 6. And since I do a lot of stuff internally, I'm just going to do 4. And how we can do this is by adding number signs. Okay. Now there's another way to do this with a percent, lowercase d, and all this other stuff, and a number. We're not going to do that. I'm just going to give you the very, very simple method right here, which uses these little number signs. Okay. Or I guess they're called hashtags now with, all the social media or whatever. But that is basically going to say this is going to be fireball underscore sim v1, and then if there's a, let's say it's frame 1, it will be 0001 because that's 4 digits of padding. Okay, so 4 number sides. Then we're going to put another dot, and then we're going to put exr. Okay, because we're going to be saving out an exr sequence. Now if it was a jpeg sequence, of course you'll want to put jpeg without the H, and all that kind of stuff. You can also just leave, I think you can just leave a dot here and not put an extension, and it will just put the extension on there, but let's just put the EXR anyway, all right? And let's click accept. So if we go over here then, you can see here it says file saving, it says file extensions, so that's where it's going to basically add the file extension at the end. So what we could do is we can actually remove this end right here, but I'm just going to hit cancel, and I'm going to then remove this because we already put the file extension. So it's really up to you on if you want to do that or not. Then right here, file format, just because we named this a .exr doesn't mean that it's going to save out as an EXR. You have to go here to the file format, change that to an OpenEXR, and then you can see all this other stuff here. And you can see there's a Z buffer, there's a preview, all this sort of stuff here. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the color here. So we want the RGB, which is the color information, red, green, and blue, and the alpha channel. And then next here it says color depth, float half or float full. Basically what this means is how much data do you want? Do you want the full amount of data or do you want the half amount of data? And a float value basically means that it's not an integer. So integers are like 1, 2, 3, 4, and a float value has, anything in between. So, a 0.0001 is a float value, for example. And you can see here that if we hover over it, says 32-bit color channels. If you want to save out a Z, you want, or the overall color, or not color depth, but the actual position in Z space, you'll want to do that because it will save out the Z depth per pixel, all this stuff right here it tells you. Now let's go over to the compositing tab and take a look at this stuff here. So if we take a look, you can see that I have a composite here, I have a viewer node, and you can see that I have the render layers. I have an image, alpha, and the depth channel that aren't going anywhere. And you can see that I have some compositing that's done here. And if I view through this, you can see that the composite is done here, and there is a glow effect and some other things. Now, this would be okay if I was going to export this for a single image or something, because if you're just doing a single image, you might as well just do your compositing in here because it's pretty easy. It really doesn't make any sense to throw this into another, program to do that if you can do all of your simple stuff right here. But if you're doing an animation, you don't know what's going to happen throughout your shot. And you might want to change the glow effects or animate them over time or any number of things. So you don't necessarily want to what's called bake out all of your compositing into your final image. Okay. So if we have our render layers here and we have all this stuff here, this might be very good for checking to see what we might want to end up doing. And then we could take some of these values and sort of use that in our other compositing program. But really, you don't want to do this. You don't really want to bake out your compositing because there's all sorts of things that you might want to do to change this. And once you've baked it out and you've spent all that time rendering, You're not going to be really happy if you have to re-render the entire thing because you decided you didn't like the comp work or the glare effect, or you wanted to add or change the color or something like that. So what we really want to do here, and you can see here that the composite only has the image going into here, okay? If you are rendering out your animation, you want to make sure that your composite node has everything plugged into it. Because when it renders, and I get a lot of people wondering why, when they're rendering out an animation, it's like blank. And that's because a lot of times this has nothing in it. Or they haven't plugged their composite into the image. So they're baking out or they're rendering out just the straight render and nothing else. And that becomes a little bit of a problem. Okay. So if we take these right here and we go image, whoops, image right here, and then we take the alpha and we plug that in, and then we take the depth and we plug that in. Then when we want to access these channels with the EXR that we're going to be rendering out, or that you would be rendering out if you did this, you can then actually render these out properly. So you have these plugged in, you have your composite node there with everything, and you're good to go. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to take this and plug this into here and have the alpha channel and the Z depth, because this is the composite. So if you do want this and you want to bake out all your stuff right from Blender, you just want to do the image, and you probably just want to save a PNG sequence or something like that. So you can at least change some of the color information. But this setup that I'm showing you right here is really, in my opinion, if you're going to use this in a comp system or a comp program. Now, let's say that you were just doing a viewport render. If you're just doing a viewport render and you don't want to do any compositing or anything like that, you just remove these, you export out the image. Don't use the alpha, because you won't want to use an alpha channel when you're just rendering out your viewport, because you want to just show what the simulation or whatever it is looks like. That's what you would want it to look like. Now, again, your export settings are kind of dependent on what it is you're trying to do. So if you are just trying to do a viewport render, your format should be pretty small. You probably don't even need 1920 by 1080. You probably just need like 50% of that. So like a 720p or something, or even less. And you would just want to export out what's in your viewport here or whatever's in your camera. That would work out just fine. And it would basically render out this animation just like this, and you can play it in real time and see what the overall speed looks like and everything else, just to make sure that everything works out well before you do your final animation render. Okay. If you're trying to do a final render, okay, you got everything figured out, you're ready to do your final samples, everything like that, what you really should do is you should do a bunch of test frames. So find a frame here, find a frame here, find a frame here, and render out those frames and take a look in your, let's actually change this to the viewer node, and we're going to look at it straight through here. You'll want to like zoom in and check to make sure that if there's a bunch of grain and a bunch of noise, and you can see here that the sampling's not that great because it's pretty noisy right in here. And that's because I hit the escape before it was actually done, because I'm just trying to show you guys how to do this. But, you know, if we zoom in quite a bit, you can see that there's a lot of noise here. So I'd probably want to let the full 256 samples render out before I did my final animation render. But if we zoom in here, or actually if we zoom out, so if we're at 4K, this is what it would look like 4K. I know you guys are looking at it like 1080p, but from this large, it looks okay. But a trick that a lot of people do is that they will render out at a 150 to 200% larger and then scale it down. Okay, so I'm just kind of visually looking at this and I'm going, okay, at this size, is it tight enough to where that noise is not a big problem? And I can then make a decision from there. And what you'll need to do is you'll need to basically just do some test frame renders, and then you'll see that at the top here, you see where it says time, right? It says 4 minutes and 35 seconds. So if you have an idea about, if you do all those test frames and you pull an average of how long those test frames took, you can then have a pretty good idea about how long it's going to take you to render the full animation. So my recommendation is do some tests, do some, try some denoising, uh, check all of your frames to make sure that you have the right sample size before you do a full animation, because nothing's worse than doing a full animation render and then noticing that you didn't have enough samples or something catastrophic is wrong with your animation and you just wasted 2 days or 3 days rendering out a full animation that just doesn't look good. The I already alluded to this, but the kind of like final recommendation that I have to you for doing your animation renders is that what you should be doing is knowing what your final format needs to be. So if you are doing a final let's say composite that's going to be an HD 1920 by 1080 format, my opinion is at least render at 150% so that when you downsample it, when you squeeze it down by scaling it down, everything will be much, much tighter. So once you have all this stuff set up, what you'll do is you'll go up here to render, render animation, and it will render your full animation. So hopefully that all made sense and you were able to follow along with me. Of course, if you have questions or anything like that, please put them down in the comments section below, or you can jump on the Discord and you can just let me know if you have any questions or comments or, other suggestions on how to render out your animations better. So thanks again for watching, everybody. Hopefully you learned something and you now have some better knowledge on how to export your renders and how to do it safely and easily for your next projects. Make sure that you're subscribed so that you can see when the new videos are released, and I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.